This is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video I'm going to be taking a look at Robert Oster Sydney Lavender. I'll be doing a writing sample on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. I'll take a look at a writing sample that I did previously on 20-pound copy paper. I'll compare Sydney Lavender to some similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Robert Oster Sydney Lavender wrote a little more wet at the beginning, even after doing a scribble first, but then evened out and wrote really uniformly. The swatch that I did with tweezers was nice and crisp, and it ranges from a medium gray purple to a lighter gray purple. A closer look at the drip at the end of the swatch shows that Robert Oster Sydney Lavender doesn't tend to sheen. I'm going to be testing more pens than normal today because I've noticed Robert Oster inks tend to be finicky in my experience with what pens and nibs they tend to perform well with, so I wanted to get a good idea of what nibs this ink is going to perform the best in. I'm going to begin with a Pilot 78G. It has a stainless steel extra fine nib. I'm going to say this is okay. With it being a lighter ink, if you can make yourself write with a light hand, this is okay. But with it being so pale, if I write with a light hand, it's pretty light. And if I write a little heavier, I don't know if it's even that noticeable. It writes a little darker, but if I'm writing heavier and try to do side strokes, it just feels scratchy. So it's okay if you write with a light hand, but the legibility is not great. Next, I've got a Pilot Pluminix. It has a stainless steel fine nib. This is the nib that came off of my Pilot Pereira. This is much nicer. The tipping's just a bit wider, so it makes it a little bit smoother. The legibility's much better, so I don't have that feeling like I need to be writing with a heavier hand. It's just all around nicer. Next, I've got another Pilot 78G. This one has a stainless steel medium nib. This feels, I would call this velvety smooth. It's smoother than the first two because the tipping's just larger, but all of these are a little bit dry. These Pilot steel nibs are just a little bit dry, so it's not, I wouldn't even call it feedback, but it just gives it a velvety smoothness. It's not glassy smooth. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom Heritage 91. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This 14 karat fine nib is wetter than the steel nibs, and you can really feel that it's much smoother. Next, I've got a Pilot Custom 74. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Okay, it started running a little dry there toward the end, and I think that's because these are dipped. You see, I don't even have a converter in there. I'm going to redip it just to show. That's what I've been experiencing in my other writing samples. So for my smaller writing, this is just a bit too wet, but if your writing is larger than this, I think this is 4mm grids. If you're writing on larger grids or lined paper, this is a little more suited for that. Next, I've got a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat fine nib. This is nice, but there's a bit of feedback. It puts down just a really nice looking crisp line. I would say this is a little bit better than the steel nib, but actually I believe this has a bit more feedback than that Pilot steel nib had. They're similar if you look at them and if you look at the smear. So if you prefer feedback, this would be the way to go. If you prefer something smoother, the Pilot fine nib is the way to go if you want a nice looking fine line. Next, I've got another Platinum 3776. This one has a 14 karat medium nib. Out of the two medium nibs, between the Pilot and the Platinum, this is my favorite medium nib. It's nice and dark and legible, puts down a nice looking line, but it's just not quite as sloppy. The Pilot medium with this ink tends to look a little sloppy. This is nice, and there's less feedback than I had with the fine nib. Very pleasant to write with and looks really good. Next, I've got a Quebeco Al Sport. It has a stainless steel medium nib. This Quebeco medium nib is just too dry, and this is the same issue I had when I used Robert Oster Cafe Crema. When I had this inked up in when I had Cafe Crema inked up in a converter, I kept having to prime the feed, and when I got tired of doing that, I put some White Lightning, which is an ink lubricant, into the converter of Cafe Crema, and it made it flow better and a little bit wetter, but it also made the ink tend to feather more. So I would say this is just not an ink that's well suited for Quebeco steel nibs, or the Quebeco Sport steel nibs. Next, I've got a Quebeco Perceo. It has a stainless steel medium nib. Now this is nice. This Quebeco nib is different from the sport nibs, I've always found it performs really well with these kind of pale, finicky inks. Very nice. And it has a chalky smoothness that's very pleasant. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Next, I've got a Quebeco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. Okay, so now I'm going to have to contradict myself or correct myself. I said this Robert Oster ink doesn't perform well with Quebeco stainless steel nibs. I would say the medium and smaller, it doesn't perform well. Really, there aren't many inks at all that don't perform well in a Quebeco broad nib. Next, I've got a Jinhao X750. It has a stainless steel 1.5 stub nib. Now this writing sample did pretty well, but I have found this broad stub nib on some smooth papers, it has a little bit of trouble grabbing the paper. While that dries, we can take a look at the 20-pound copy paper. Okay, on the copy paper you can see Robert Oster Sydney Lavender looks very similar to Monteverde Elephant. But Monteverde Elephant is a very wet, lubricated ink, and Robert Oster's Sydney Lavender, it's a watery ink, but it feels dry. And so you can see all of these writing samples, how quickly they soaked into the paper. The only one that had any kind of a smear, like I do the X and then smear it immediately. The only one that smeared any at all was the broad nib. All the others dried immediately. Now I found that most of my pens just felt too wet. It felt like I was writing with water, and the ink, you could see the ink spreading and just little feathers. The letters look a little ragged. It wasn't horrible, it just wasn't pleasant to write with until I got to the finer nibs. You can see the platinum fine nib. It was pretty nice, but there was quite a bit of feedback. But the two pilot nibs felt really nice. Now, where the pilot extra fine, when I'm writing on really smooth paper with a pale ink like this, I mentioned that I feel like I have to press harder to get it to write darker. It's just a subconscious thing. On this really absorbent copy paper, it just draws the ink out of the nib and it puts down a fairly medium dark line, and it looks really nice, and I don't have that feeling that I need to be writing with more of a heavy hand. I can write really lightly, and both of these felt really nice. I put okay on the extra fine because I just got finished writing with the fine and that just spoiled me. It is that pilot fine steel nib is very pleasant to write with on copy paper with this ink. The bleed through is about average. If you're using one of those fine nibs, the extra fine or the fine, you could get by with using both sides of the paper. I don't have a lot of inks in my collection that compare to Robert Oster Sydney Lavender. One of the few inks was Robert Oster's Summer Storm, and you can see the little swatch I did on the ink bottle looks quite a bit different. But when you're just looking at the swatch that I did with the tweezers, Summer Storm is just slightly more blue, and Sydney Lavender is a bit more lavender. Monteverde Elephant is a similar type of purple, but it's much more saturated and it's a much wetter writer. Robert Oster Sydney Lavender I prefer in some of the wider nibs, the medium and larger, when I'm writing on nice fountain pen friendly paper. The Monteverde Elephant was close enough to being a black ink that I just don't like black inks in wide nibs. And finally, I'm putting Diamine Earl Grey out here. It has a similar amount of saturation. It's not the same color, but if you've used Diamine Earl Grey and you know how it performs in your pens, I found that pens that I like to use Diamine Earl Grey in, Sydney Lavender performs similarly. Robert Oster's Sydney Lavender is not water resistant. I wrote a writing sample with all my pens that I have inked up here and let it dry and submerged it for 10 minutes in water, and none of it was left behind. Okay, my writing samples on Tomoe River paper. Not much show through because this is a paler ink. No, I don't have any spots even on the heavy areas in the swatches and the scribbles. Nothing even got deep into the paper. all of the writing samples look great. The extra fine is a little bit pale, but the fine nibs look great. The wider nibs have some nice subtle shading. I think my favorite pen was, I have two favorites. The Platinum medium nib for good fountain pen paper, nice smooth paper, and for not so great paper like your copy papers and more absorbent papers, I like the Pilot Steel fine nib. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.